Hare Krishna.
Krishna Maharaj.
Hey, Haribo living entities, if I may call you that. Let's see. There's one other thing. Let's see. Okay. So should we begin? Hey, where's Manju? I don't see Manju.
He's here, Maharaj.
Hi, Maharaj.
Hey, Manju, can't see you.
Oh, I was studying on Maharaj. I'm sitting at my computer. That's why I turned my camera off.
Oh, because everyone came to get your darshan.
Yeah, I gotta, ration it out, Maharaj.
That's right. Don't want to be overexposed. Okay. So, Hare Krishna, where is the aquatic incarnation?
She's there too, Maharaj.
Hare Krishna. So, Manju, please announce tonight's topic.
Okay, Maharaj, let me go back to it. Let me find it. 1 second. So tonight's topic is, bear with me 1 second. I have to find it. Almost there.
Okay.
I lied. I'm not almost there. I'm getting there.
I think it's
Okay.
free will. Yeah.
Freedom, free will, desire, independence in the context of Krishna consciousness.
Okay, thank you. Who picked that topic, by the way?
Ram Giridhari Prabhu, and he's not on. So that's not good.
So I'm going to approach this in the following way. First of all, there are some so-called philosophers who I think are not the best and the brightest, who argue that we don't have free will, that everything is deterministic. If this sounds a bit silly, it is. But I'd like to give 3 arguments, because some people actually argue that. And it's sort of what I would call scientism. Scientism, as opposed to science, is, I'll read you the definition from the dictionary. Thought or expression regarded as, excessive belief in the power of scientific knowledge and techniques. In other words, whatever worldview someone has, one may be reasonable or one can be fanatical. And so scientism means that one is fanatical about the power of science to explain everything. And so, as we know, in the world of empirical science, controlled experiments are done. And if the theory is correct, then the scientist can predict the result. And as we know, physical things are not conscious. Krishna explains in Bhagavad Gita, he has an inferior energy and a superior energy. Inferior energy is matter, whereas the superior energy is the living being, which directly indicates that the inferior energy is not alive and certainly not conscious. Sometimes in the Bhagavatam, it's called Jada Prakriti. It's sort of like dull matter or dead matter. So we all have, I hope, self-evident first-person experience within our own minds that we actually make choices. We have choices and we decide things. So if we do not have free will, that would mean that everything is simply being done. In other words, given the initial, it's so stupid that, but I guess I have to go through it because some philosophers actually claim that the idea being that given the initial conditions of our birth, that we actually don't have free will, we just act according to the conditions. For example, you get a certain kind of body with a specific neurology, you are born into a certain environment. So It's sort of the environment acting upon your nervous system, your brain, so you are sort of programmed to do things. One result of that is that people who deny free will actually don't believe it. They're not really choosing to argue against it. They're just programmed to do that. Now, it's very interesting because according to materialism, sort of blind materialism, fanatical materialism, there's nothing but matter. There's no soul. Consciousness is just a byproduct of matter. So, of course, the first problem with that theory, and an extraordinary problem, is that to say everything is matter is scientifically, ultimately, kind of meaningless, for the simple reason that we don't know what matter is. Now, it's very interesting. Like if you look at the symbol of NASA, where you see sort of like that old idea that there is a nucleus, right? In the atom, there's a nucleus that has protons and neutrons. It's very neat. It's very, it's a very nice little idea. There's protons and neutrons. Neutrons have a neutral charge, protons have a positive charge. Even though I slept through my high school chemistry class, somehow I remember this. And the electrons, and they're like satellites, just like the Earth or other planets orbit the sun. So these electrons are orbiting the nucleus of the atom, actually. Now, the only problem is, according to the latest quantum physics, that's not really what's there. And as far as what is there, we don't really know. There's the wave particle debacle, where, is it, are these little atomic particles, are they waves, are they atoms? There's or waves or particles, spooky action at a distance. You know what that is, right? Spooky action at a distance. That's an official scientific term, by the way, spooky action at a distance. It means that they've done these experiments where if you have two particles that are bonded because one is positive and one is negative, sounds like some marriages, right? Anyway, so if you have these two particles where one is positive and one is negative, and they're bonded, then if you separate them, even by like 20 miles, or in principle, any distance, and then if you change the charge on one of those particles, say from positive to negative, the other one immediately changes also. And no one has any idea whatsoever how they're communicating, because no one knows that. So there's all kinds of problems. So we don't really know what matter is. But let's go for now with just kind of an old-fashioned idea of matter. And so in order to prove a deterministic model of human consciousness, in other words, whatever we think is just determined by whatever we think we're choosing is really determined by a set of material conditions. Now, in order to prove that kind of goofy idea, in order to prove that, you would have to actually show that we know enough about the conditions in matter to explain all kinds of apparent human choices. The problem is we don't have that knowledge. In other words, let's say you just take the life of a person, like, anyone ever see the Truman Show? That guy Truman? Anyway, so let's say you take the life of any particular person, and let's say this person P, at a certain moment in time T, makes a decision D. But the point is, we just don't know enough about neurology, about brain states, about the effects of the environment on our nervous system. There's not enough information to deterministically explain human behavior, human choices. So even if someone does say that our apparently free choices or decisions are actually physically, materially determined by conditions, we don't know enough yet to demonstrate that. So it's just someone's imagination. Secondly, so the science is just not there. as I said, it's counterintuitive because we all experience directly that in fact we do make decisions. And there's no evidence. First person experience, there's a sense in which your experience of your own existence as an individual person is epistemically primary. In other words, there's no one else in the universe except God who experiences as intimately and directly as you do what it's like to be you. And so you, as a conscious individual being, have a privileged or a superior vantage point of what you are actually doing. Now, you could say examples where people think they're choosing, but psychology can say, well, that's because you have a certain psychological condition, or your brain is a certain way. But that's not. But it doesn't really apply in this case, because let me bring in another point here. According to our philosophy in Bhagavad Gita, the amount of free will increases or decreases directly in the ratio that one rises or descends in the three modes of nature. In other words, let's take an example of someone in the mode of ignorance, say someone who's a drug addict, which is very much in the mode of ignorance. So that person, being in the mode of ignorance, has very little free will because maybe that person's an addict. For example, there are some choices. If you make certain decisions and carry them out, those decisions will radically decrease your free will. For example, let's say someone tragically is suicidal and jumps off a building, and then in the most awful case, halfway down, changes their mind. The point is that once you made that decision, you have to accept the consequences of it. Like, for example, let's say someone, for whatever, Nitai, you see people with different kinds of addictions and compulsive behavior. And so there are certain kinds of choices which, if you make those choices, you are radically decreasing your ability to make other choices. Like if one becomes a drug addict, if people become, there's all kinds of 12-step programs now, right? Sex addicts, gambling addicts, drug addicts. So addiction is a psychological condition in which one has thrown oneself into the mode of ignorance and thereby destroyed most of one's ability to make further choices. And the mode of passion, they even say a person is driven, right? That's an expression. A person is driven. A car is driven. So if we say you're driven, it can mean by your own passion, but still it's something which a person works themselves up into such a passionate state that they can't step back. It's like if you're in your car and you step on the gas and the car is going 80, 90 miles an hour, if you decide you want to slow down, it's going to take a while. And so in the mode of passion, one has more free will, but the extent to which one is driven by that passion, to that extent, one really, can't necessarily make rational decisions. First of all, in the mode of passion, as Krishna explains in Bhagavad Gita 18:21 and 18:31, in the mode of passion, you just don't see clearly. Ayatavat prajanati, Krishna says, that one understands things inaccurately. Ayatavat means literally inaccurately. That's I think 1831. So then in the mode of goodness, you see things, at least the material world, fairly accurately. Of course, if one is in the mode of goodness but doesn't understand Krishna, then one will not understand the best spiritual choices, or even as it impacts material life. For example, many of us, not most of us, have experienced that if you become seriously engaged in practicing bhakti yoga, you overcome certain bad habits. I know when I was when I was 20 years old and joined the Hare Krishna movement, I became freed from different kinds of attachments that were, causing me nothing but unhappiness. And when I joined the movement, they just, those attachments vanished because I got a real higher taste. And that's what Krishna says, that parang drishtva nivartate. If you have we often say higher taste, literally what Krishna says, seeing something higher. He doesn't really say taste. Parang drishtva, having seen something higher, nivartate, one steps back from material attachment. So we have this goodness, passion, and ignorance. Now, if let's say a neurologist or a scientist that wants to say we don't have free will says, well, look at this person, their behavior is so much dominated by addictions, attachment, so on. But you have to look at the person in the mode of goodness. That is a straw man argument. If you look at people in the lower modes, then we would say, yes, their free will diminishes as they descend in the modes of nature. But if you look at an advanced devotee or someone in the mode of goodness, then you find much more discretion. You find people acting rationally. They choose things not because of passion or attachment or addiction, but because they make a lucid calculation and decide that this course of action is in my rational self-interest. Now, another argument against this amazing idea that we don't have free will is that it actually doesn't work within the context of evolutionary biology. Now, if generally atheists are, I would say it seems like most of them, they tend to be materialists. And of course, no one really knows what that means anymore since we don't know what matter is, but they tend to believe that the physical world, whatever it is all there is. Actually, as I'm saying this now, it's just like, it baffles me how people can be so foolish. Because if you don't know what matter is, matter may not be purely physical. There may be other things there which are metaphysical, because if you don't know what something is, you just don't know what it is. And you can't say, well, I don't know what it is, but I know what it's not. I mean, think about that logically. That's basically what the materialists are saying. I don't know what it is, but I don't know what it's not. But I don't know what it is, but I do know what it's not. I don't know how that sounds to you, but to me, it sounds like really bad logic. Now you could say, well, someone could, argue against what I said and say, well, for example, I don't know what the capital of Iceland is, but I know it's not Tokyo. So if you say, I don't know what the capital of Iceland is, but I know it's not Tokyo, or I don't know what this person's, I don't know where this person lives, but I know that this person doesn't live on Jupiter. I mean, technically you don't really know that because that person could be an alien. So you don't really know the person doesn't live on Jupiter. But as far as saying, I don't know what the capital of Iceland is, but I know it's not Tokyo. Well, that's because you feel you have enough relevant information. For example, you believe you understand earthly geography and that Japan is very, very far away from Iceland and Tokyo is the capital of Japan. And therefore, it's very unlikely that it's the capital of two countries. But you don't really know that. Let's say you actually didn't know. It's not like, okay, I can't remember the capital of Iceland, but if I hear it, Reykjavik, if I hear it, then I know it. No, you really just don't know. I mean, how do you know? What if Japan conquered Iceland? Extremely unlikely, but not logically impossible. So in other words, you would be convinced that I don't know what the capital of Iceland is, but I know it's not Tokyo. You would say that, or could say that rationally, only to the extent you know a lot of other things about those two countries. But I would say that in terms of proportions, we do not know as much about matter as, let's say, a person knows about world geography when they say that I don't know what the capital of Iceland is, but I know it's not Tokyo. For example, scientists now believe that most of the universe, I forget the percentage, 3/4 of it or 90%, I forget the percentage, is what they call dark matter. Let's see if I can get a number for you right here. Dark matter seems to outweigh visible matter roughly 6-1, making up about 27% of the universe. Here's a sobering fact. The matter we know and that makes up all stars and galaxies only accounts for 5% of the content of the universe. So now, the matter that we don't understand, but we know something about, I mean, obviously we know something about matter, but we don't really understand what it ultimately is. No one does, at least no humans. That's only 5% of the universe. So, I mean, what could be, I don't know, I'm trying to be a gentleman here and not say words like idiotic. It's really hard. It's like, it's just hard. But if you get people, I mean, these people are just, okay, I won't say the I word, but they say the universe is nothing in the universe but matter, even though we are entirely ignorant about 95% of it. And the 5% we do know, we don't know what it ultimately is. So physicalism, philosophical materialism is becoming more and more absurd. It's becoming just absurd. It's like, it reminds me of fanatical, let's say, Catholics in the, who even after Copernicus or after Newton, they were still trying to hang on to, medieval astronomy. And they kept doing that. You had like Ptolemy. Ptolemy was a Greek ruler of Egypt. He was, coming after Alexander, conquered that area. And he was also a great astronomer. And so he came up with this Ptolemaic, this explanation for planetary motion and stellar motion. And it worked really well. He had all these, equations and things, and it was based on epicycles, like as celestial bodies move around the sun or wherever they're going, they also have their own little circles, epicycles, and it worked very well. And that was the accepted science for, I'm sure, over 1,000 years. Actually, let's see when Ptolemy was living. Anyway, the point I'm going to make is it turned out he was wrong. Okay, he was 100 AD. So until, let's say, Galileo, and so he's 100 AD. By the way, you have to pay extra because I'm looking up these things. So I just want you to know that. Galileo was in the 1564 to 1642. So he's Renaissance man. He's working around the turn of the century from the 1500s to 1600s onto the, so he's 1,500 years later. So approximately 1,500 years, they had it wrong, but that was science. It was taught in every university in the Western world. It was science, and if you didn't believe it, you were a fool. 1,500 years, it turned out it was wrong. And of course, they figured out it was wrong because of precession, which is, so I can get a little definition for you here. The slow movement of the axis of a spinning body, blah, blah, blah. See, what it means is that, anyway, the planets aren't as precise as he thought. So then Descartes came up with no, first you have Galileo, and then you have all these people, Copernicus and all these great astronomers. And so meanwhile, the church, they put all their money on the Ptolemy horse, and that horse wasn't coming in. And so it was like a real struggle. Then okay, now what do we do? So then Descartes came up with a picture. So they just, okay, let's put our money on Descartes. But then you had, further advances and Newton and everything. And it turned out Descartes, well, didn't really get it right. And so the church was hanging on to it. Like the world was moving on, the world was moving on. It's like they hung on to Ptolemy, and after Galileo, they were hanging on to everything until even Descartes, until even after Newton. And so they were still hanging on to Ptolemy. So it's like that, because what does the church have in common? What does the church have in common with the atheistic science? A lot. A lot. What they have in common is basic human psychology. Because both the church, before, they slipped from power, and science today, they were ruling. They sort of were the gatekeepers of objective knowledge, and power corrupts. Both of them. You see, you can say, okay, one group is atheist, one group is theist, so-called. But in fact, the same human psychology is operating. A group of people who have a lot of power, who are very attached to that power, whose power is sort of like linked to a particular theory which is failing, but they can't let go of the theory because then they'll be embarrassed, they may lose power. And so in terms of human psychology, the church clinging to ancient wrong astronomical theories in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary, psychologically is very, very similar to the multi-trillion-dollar scientific establishment clinging to these idiotic notions of physicalism in the face of overwhelming evidence that coming from microbiology, it's coming from everywhere, that it's absurd. It's just an absurdity. But what we find is that human populations, when humans have power, they will cling to their power for centuries in the face of overwhelming evidence. It's all about power and not wanting to be embarrassed and humiliated. So, but actually, 95% of the universe is not covered by science at all. And the 5%, not at all. They know something, they know it's there. They have no idea what it is. And then 5%, the 5% of the universe that, that scientists deal with, they don't even know what that is ultimately, because it's matter, but they haven't figured out what matter is ultimately. And so here, based on having an inconclusive, unsettled understanding of 5% of the universe, and therefore claiming they know how everything in the universe operates, is, I'm tempted to say, insanity. I don't know, Nitai may want to reserve that for clinical diagnosis rather than philosophical absurdity. But still, that's what we're talking about. A group of people who are not quite sure what 5% of the universe is, and really have almost no clue what 95% of the universe is, and yet claiming that they do know what the whole universe is, which is matter. It's madness. As much as it was madness to continue teaching Ptolemaic astronomy in the universities in Europe, even after Newton, after Galileo, Brahe, Tycho Brahe, after all these great astronomers, after Newton, they were still teaching Ptolemy. And just like in universities today, even with the collapse of the notion, something that no reasonable person could take seriously, that the universe is just matter, they're still teaching in the universities for psychological reasons, not for philosophical or scientific reasons. And so another point I'll make here, and then I want to get back to free will, which I hope will interest you, is that the notion that some of us may have, the false notion that Western universities, or nowadays just universities in general, are centers of like free thinking, where people are free to explore different ideas. Are you kidding? First of all, if you look at the history of universities, say the history of Western universities, there's a very, very small window of time in which they actually promoted free thinking. The universities were founded, approximately, roughly about 1,000 years ago, a little more, some of them, and they were church schools. So they weren't, and you could think freely within the boundaries of church dogma. Within the boundaries of church dogma, sure, you could, come up with some ideas. Then gradually, that's the whole rise of secularism, modernism, science, industrial revolution. Gradually, the churches are taken over by secular, really, ultimately, materialism, atheism. And just try getting a job in a philosophy department, which is not a religious school, if it's known that ultimately you're like, you really are interested in a religious worldview. Or so the amount of time in which university faculties really encourage different points of view, free thinking, is it's a very small time. And hopefully, but the pendulum is moving, because I'll just say it very quickly, and then I'll leave this topic and go back to free will. That because you had this awful religious fanaticism that caused all kinds of brutality and murders, tortures. I mean, it was awful, just incredibly horrible. All the human suffering caused by these various churches. So the intellectuals reacted against it, and they went to the other extreme. Pendulum effect, a term, by the way, coined by Galileo. So the pendulum effect. But the point is, religion has now been domesticated for the most part. Religion has been sort of, it's sort of docile. I mean, there's people that, religious people that want to influence the appointment of Supreme Court judges, and they're still active in that. But for the most part, they're not a threat to science. In most places, they're not a threat to science. And therefore, since they're not a threat, the reaction against them is also weakening. And as the reaction weakens, people that used to favor materialism just as a way to keep religion out of the laboratory now see no need for that. And it turns out that materialism is really awful philosophy. It's really terrible philosophy, just on philosophical grounds for various reasons. So anyway, going back to free will and applying this whole analysis to free will, how would it be the case? Because if there's no free will, then we live in a deterministic, totally physical universe or world, whatever that means. But the point is that according to atheistic theories of evolution, certain genetic mutations are selected for only one reason, because they provide reproductive advantage. Let's say a particular mutation makes a particular animal stronger. Well, that means that animal's more likely to survive and therefore more likely to reproduce. So it's actually just reproductive advantage. So the question is, how would the belief that we do have free will, how would that confer reproductive advantage? It seems like it would do the opposite. Because if everyone is just reacting mechanically, like let's say like insects that don't have a lot of consciousness and free will, like an ant colony or a beehive, then they tend to act efficiently. And so if you say there's no free will, but some creatures believe they have it, how would belief in a fictitious free will, how would belief in a free will that doesn't exist clearly confer reproductive advantages? And therefore, even according to the theory of, let's say, the atheistic theory of evolutionary biology, why would that be selected? And to make the necessary cerebral changes, neurological changes to get a creature to believe in free will, let's say a Homo sapien, it would involve, it's very complicated. It's not just like, okay, don't push this button, push that button. It requires all kinds of extremely complicated and incredibly improbable mutations that have no reproductive advantage. So on those grounds of evolutionary biology and the fact that our deepest intuition tells us that we do have free will, and the fact that the science is not even close to being able to demonstrate a totally deterministic model. You can say that our deep intuition ultimately doesn't mean anything, but that's hypocritical because atheistic scientists believe simply on their intuition that there's a real physical world outside their mind. You can't prove there's a real, in other words, you cannot empirically prove that there's a real physical world outside your mind, because that would necessarily involve circular reasoning or begging the question. For example, because you're trying to prove that the physical world is real. So if you say, okay, I can prove it, this is a real water bottle. Please don't become envious, but gurus drink Fiji water. So don't worry, anytime when I visit you, I will give you some of my Fiji water because you're also a guru. So the point is that anyway, it's if you say that human testimony doesn't really prove anything, like for example, you always hear this kind of, frankly, somewhat stupid argument. I'm sorry to use such strong language, but it's just what it is. Like if you say, for example, that most people in the world believe in some type of supernatural existence or entity or God or something, they'll say, well, that doesn't prove anything. Really? If that doesn't prove anything, then you are promoting a radical skepticism about human testimony. So if we go with radical skepticism about human testimony, then what do we do about the human testimony that there's a real world outside our minds? That's also human testimony. And you can't prove it because your experience of the world as something real outside your mind, that can't be empirically verified. So the system, any system of knowledge like empiricism, is based on a foundational assumption which cannot be verified within the system. Because necessarily, if you try to verify it within the system, then necessarily you're involved in circular reasoning. So, for example, let's say you go to sleep at night, you dream, and then you wake up. Now, when you wake up, you make a decision very quickly that the world you are now experiencing is somehow ontologically more real than the world you experience in your dream. Prove it. How will you prove it? First of all, the dream world is no longer available to empirical study. The dream world is gone. You cannot retrieve it. You cannot study it. So how can you prove that? How can you prove that your waking state, or the world you perceive when you're awake, is the real world and not the world of your dream? On what grounds do you say that? The only possible explanation is because you have an experience, the quality of which proves to you it's self-evident. But if human testimony means nothing, what about all the human testimony that waking states somehow give you a more real picture of the world than dream states? If human testimony means nothing, what about human testimony that racism is bad? What about human testimony that slavery is bad? If human testimony means nothing, then why is that human testimony important? Why have democracy? It's so funny because, a lot of these scientists who say that, well, that doesn't prove anything, that so many people believe in God, but why do they believe in democracy? Why do they tend to be leftists politically? Why do they believe in democracy? Because democracy is saying that that our society is to be organized according to human testimony. But if human testimony doesn't prove anything, then voting doesn't prove anything. So the hypocrisy, the contradictions, the sheer nonsense is unlimited. I mean, we could go on all night and for a week, and we wouldn't come to the end of all the nonsense that is coming from materialism. So anyway, just given you a few things. So as you can see, my view is we have free will. Krishna obviously endorses free will because he tells Arjuna, Yatecha Sita Takuru, as you desire, act in that way. Now that statement, which is at the end of the Gita, would be meaningless if Arjuna didn't have free will. So Krishna directly endorses free will. Okay, I think I'll stop there. And now, Nitai, get out the thermometer where people make donations and thermometer keeps going higher and higher. And then when it gets high enough, then I will end the program. So, okay, I can see Abhishek wants to start us off here with a very generous gift. So any questions? And Ananda Leela, you can tell us if there are any questions on other social media platforms. I feel very up to date. I just said social media platforms. Makes me feel very youthful. So, any questions?
So Maharaj, you just, it was mind-boggling what you described the university, the free will. How is a devotee? What we pursue? Where we go from there?
Well, fortunately, just like almost everybody in the world knows that modern architecture is terrible and that modern art, a lot of it is just absolute nonsense. And so what you have is you have these little elites, like this elite little group of art critics who are just imposing all this nonsense on the world. I remember one time I was in Beverly Hills. I was there and I was in the Bank of America, and they had a sort of like a building on this little sort of, triangle. And so in the front of the building, like a plaza, they had this modern art sculpture. So I was in the bank, I'm talking to these young people, they work for the bank. We were doing whatever I came there for. And I said, oh, by the way, someone left some garbage out in front of your building. And they said, really? I said, yeah, it sort of looks like a sculpture. And they just laughed. They said, yeah, totally. So it's just one of those things where everyone in the world, except art critics and people that think they're sophisticated, everyone else knows it's all nonsense. And in the same way, I mean, there's a lot of things like that. It's like modern architecture. Who did I just, I was making the point that in other academic departments, they have all their, cockeyed theories, and then they write a book, and then it's, an intellectual fashion for a while, but then it goes out of style. And so the world is free of it. The worst is the architects, because when they, have some crazy idea, we're stuck with it for 50 years or longer. And so, so the good news here is that I would say most people about these topics that I'm talking about actually have some common sense. And they're just kind of being badgered and harassed by these culture elites with all of their crazy. There was a British philosopher, I can't remember his name. He passed away recently, but he was making the point that some of this modern art is really an attack on civilization. It's an attack on the very notion that there is objective beauty in the world, because all these values, like moral values, aesthetic values, they're ultimately based in an absolute truth. Because if there's an absolute truth, then there's an absolute basis for moral judgments and aesthetic judgments. And so because many of these people are atheists, therefore they intentionally make things which are awful, because they're trying to make the point that there is no such thing as objective beauty or ugliness or good, or, it has no, because there's no God, therefore there's no foundation, there's no basis to claim that any aesthetic or moral judgments are objective. And so really a lot of this, just god-awful modern art is, this nonsense. It's like, putting a dot on a canvas or putting nothing on canvas. It's funny because there was a guy in England who wanted to expose this nonsense. And so he had his dog just walk around in different paints and just walk on a canvas. And then he put it out and said, this is, modern art by some up and coming great new artist. And all the most sophisticated art critics were saying, yeah, I can see that he or she, is trying to say this and that. It was a dog walking around. And so, there's nothing in one sense quite as loony as the visual arts, because there's no standard. There's no standard. And so, so I think the good news is that that most people I found have common sense, actually have common sense, and they're very receptive to our ideas. So I think what we have to do is dethrone these false gods of culture, and and just spread Krishna consciousness. That's our job. Prabhupada came to make us Brahmanas. It's our duty to free the people, because you will find when you go out to preach that most people agree with us on these points. So I don't see a problem. So anything else?
Namgidari Prabhu, it was your topic. So you have any questions, comments? Maharaj.
Hare Krishna, Dandavad Maharaj. This is Ramgiri Daridas here.
Can you turn your camera on so we can make sure it's really you and not, you weren't abducted by aliens, and it's not just, someone.
Sure, Maharaj. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.
You mentioned about the free will, and as Nitai Gaurasundar Prabhu mentioned, it is definitely I need to hear this 4 times before I get to fully understand the concept. The reason I was asking this question is, this topic, I was requesting this topic was, Prabhupada says that, we have to be independently thoughtful. Yes. In our process in, growing in Krishna consciousness. So independently thoughtful versus obedience versus following the parampara. And if you put them into a context.
I'll explain. It's the point is this. For example, Prabhupada gave us certain basic principles that we have to follow. Like, for example, America supposedly is a free country. So that doesn't mean you can break the law. I think anyone with common sense knows that free country doesn't mean you can go out and shoot someone or you can steal, unless, of course, you're living in a West Coast city ruled by, with a far left city government that, doesn't enforce crime, doesn't, enforce the law for certain people. But let's say, for example, in the more sane cities of the country, the fact that it's a free country doesn't mean you can break the law. In fact, the condition for freedom is that people follow the law. That's a precondition to have a free society. So in the same way, if you want to be in Krishna consciousness, if you want to be under Krishna's shelter, just like if you follow the law, then you're protected by the government. But if you break the law, then that same government that protected you will punish you. And so in the same way, Prabhupada said that if you live within certain principles, you will be under Krishna's protection. And so it's always under the protection of a higher authority that you can actually be free. You're not absolutely free because you don't have absolute power. And therefore, absolute freedom belongs only to God, because God is the only omnipotent, omniscient being, and therefore the only one who really can handle absolute freedom. And so you are free within the context of being a law-abiding citizen of the kingdom of God.
Fair enough. We are definitely not trying to disobey or trying to deviate from the law that is within the framework. Like, for example, Prahlad Maharaj, he never disrespected his dad, but he never once obeyed his dad. So unfortunately, when we kind of disobey but not disrespect, it may be misconstrued. So the point I was trying to say is that in the process of practicing Krishna consciousness, there are many places in practices we see. So sometimes we start to question, am I correct, or how I am correct? How am I, it's about our own practices vis-a-vis what Srila Prabhupada is expecting, or what the movement is expecting, what the
Yes, yes, but Prabhupada, first of all, Prahlad was only a 5-year-old boy, but Prabhupada created a movement in which you're supposed to be a mature adult. To accept a bona fide guru doesn't mean you remain in a childlike state for the rest of your life. That's a serious misunderstanding of the guru-disciple relationship. The duty of the guru is just to give you relevant guidance, not to micromanage your life. And we've seen when gurus tried to do that, it's been a disaster. I mean, the guru tries to tell a disciple how to manage his business. I mean, that's awful. Prabhupada knew about business and his disciples were just immature. So he just gave them some common sense advice. And even as GBC in different places, I've told people, don't do this, do that, not managing their company, but just, so they wouldn't just do crazy things. But ultimately, it's just like if you have children, you want your children to grow up to be mature and intelligent. For the parents, if a child doesn't grow up, or is like 42-year-old child living at home, it's terrible for the parents. They want the child to go out and be a respectable, worthwhile citizen. So a bona fide guru doesn't want to keep you as a mental child. So if a disciple is mature and go out and take care of themselves and do something in the world and somehow acquire resources that can be used in Krishna's service, that's what the guru wants. And also, Prabhupada made a clear distinction between, I wrote a paper on that. Nitai, have you seen that paper? Understanding Prabhupada?
Talked about it, Maharaj, but I never got hold of it.
Oh my God.
Get it?
Oh my God. I can't believe, well, actually I do believe it. I'm going to fix that right now. I'm going to send it to you, to my other fellow gurus, Abhishek and Manjari. Manjari's a reader. So I'll send it to you right now because it's so important that you read this.
Maybe next month we can discuss on that, Maharaj.
Yes, basically what I did is I made a serious study. It's on the way. Abhishek, you'll be tested on that. So I did a serious study of everything Prabhupada said, the Shastra says about the content and the limitations, the boundaries of the knowledge of a pure devotee. In other words, what can we say with confidence? A pure devotee definitely knows this. And what things, like for example, Prabhupada said that if you think he's expert in material subjects just because he's a guru, he said that's ludicrous. Ludicrous, that's Prabhupada's word. Ludicrous, by the way, means comically absurd. Comically absurd. So therefore, the idea among certain people that Prabhupada knows everything about everything goes directly against what Prabhupada said. And so anyway, I explain all these things in detail, you'll see. And so I just sent you the paper. So the duty of a guru is to train his disciple to be a mature, intelligent person who can come up with his or her own good ideas. Not to keep the disciples a mental child.
Thank you, Maharaj. I guess I may have to hear your presentation probably a couple of times to assimilate the basic concepts of
Also,
free will and freedom.
sure, and Nitai Gaurasundar can send you the paper about the other topic.
Sure.
Any other questions?
Sriman, you don't have any question for Maharaj?
Ananda Leela, you have a question? Where's Ananda Leela? Do you have any questions? Any questions come in? Okay. So is that it?
I have Dandavat Pranam Maharaj. I have to
Yes.
say something, one little thing, and what you just say, a disciple cannot be a child all his or her life, and very good example is life of Sripad Ramanujacharya. What his guru said, it did not make sense. Immediately he came to a public place at the top of the building, he gave that mantra, open. So that's called independence growing up. That's another great example, what you just said. That's how I think. That's my comment a little bit.
Yeah, that's a good point. So, okay, here's a question that came in. Who sets one's karma for your next life? You do. I mean, it's a system. So based on the choices that we've made in this life, then we get what's fair. So that's the Krishna said. Actually, Krishna says in the Gita, "Maya dhakshena prakriti suyate sacharacharam." So Krishna says, by my literally supervision. Super in Latin means above. Supervision. That's the Latin-based word in English. The Germanic word in English, meaning the same thing, would be oversight. Right? German Übersicht. You know, oversight is Germanic and supervision is Latin. And that's exactly what Krishna says. Adhi aksha. Aksha, I, vision, and adhi, over, above. So Krishna literally says, by my supervision or my oversight, maya dhakshena prakriti suyate. Prakriti is giving birth, sachara charam, to all the living beings, moving and unmoving. Sachara charam is just a way of saying everybody. So that's karma, because karma determines your birth, right? Karma determines your birth, and therefore, so Krishna says, by my supervision, nature is doing this. So, any other question? Okay, well, thank you all very much. Always a pleasure. Always a pleasure. Oh, there's one more question. Let's see. Nanda Leela's my, what would you call it? My handler. Let's see. Do the other jivas not in a human body have free will? They choose to be here, so they had free will, but it's now limited by their choice. Yes, exactly. The example I gave, you decide to jump off of, well, I won't say you, that's terrible. But if someone, you know, jumps off a building, they chose something, but once they choose and the consequences manifest, that's it. If you know, there's many things in life that once you choose them, it's like in a marriage, you know, a man or a woman can cheat on their spouse and they choose to do that, and then the other person finds out and the relationship is broken. Some people forgive, but a lot of people don't. And so it's like Prabhupada said with glass. He said, when you break a sheet of glass, you can glue it back together, but it's never the same. And so there are certain decisions we make that are irrevocable, that you have to, you know, as the saying goes, you made your bed, now you have to lie in it. Because if you didn't get the consequences for your actions, then the world would just be moral chaos. How would we ever learn anything? If parents don't teach their children that your actions have consequences, the children will grow up being wild animals. As some people are. So let's see. Do the other jivas not in a human body? Okay, I answered that. So that's it, I think. Okay, so again, thank you all very much. Always a pleasure to be with my fellow teachers there. So, who's that in Nandalila's place? Oh, is that Radhika? Oh, Radhika.
Jai.
I hope you heard the class.
Yeah. Thank you.
Have to talk. Yeah, Radhika is a very, very good disciple. So, thank you all very much. And thank you, Nitai, the patriarch of the family. Although
Thank you, Maharaj.
that's not politically correct, I guess, to be a patriarch nowadays.
Whatever you say is correct, Maharaj. You are Brahma of this.
Okay, Hare Krishna. See you all
Thank you,
soon.
Maharaj. Hare Krishna.
Hare Bol.
Hare Krishna.
Hare
Thank
Krishna.
you. Thank you.